acknowledging that I'm acknowledging that I'm on Darkinjung, a lot of the land on the central coast of New South Wales, and acknowledging the elders, past, present, and future of this land. We are fortunate in this area to, I guess, be teaching many of the young people who will become future elders, as well as having connections in different organisations and groups with the current eldership in this area. Thank you. Thank you, Hamed.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Chris, and hello and welcome everyone. This is the second session or second webinar of a webinar series that a group of us, including Chris, who is hosting the session today, and Daniela, one of the speakers, also Associate Professor Penny Bikes, and I have developed together in partnership with New Economy Network Australia, NENA. The purpose of the project, as I have explained it in a little bit more details in the first session, June 23rd, is to actually explore what we may call alternative visions and views of around quality of life and well-being, in order to promote a much more inclusive public debate around how quality of life, especially at the community level, at the social level, need to be defined. So the title of the project is Reimagining Quality of Life Post-COVID. So the project has three components. One is a nationwide surveying, social survey of many hundreds of organizations almost ready to go, and then some in-depth interviews, as well as this webinar series. And through this webinar series, which is almost monthly, started from June until November, every month we have around 3 speakers that express and explain their perspectives about well-being and quality of life. The very first one on June was more introductory kind of presentations, but this one, the second one in July that you're attending, is around the Indigenous perspectives and so on and so forth. The programs and all the details can be found on the NENA, New Economy Network Australia website, as well as the University of Newcastle website, if you Google for Alternative Futures Research Network. If you are interested to know more about the projects, I will put a number of links on the chat room for you to consult, and we're happy to also mention that the recording of the previous webinar is available on YouTube. Again, I put a link to that. I think that should be enough for me. Yeah. And I'm handing it back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Hamed. All right, are we ready to kick off? Are you happy to speak, Mary?
I'll start. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that first question about reimagining. Well, the main theme, I get is reimagining what quality of life could be, what it could be. Well, starting off from an Aboriginal point of view, I guess, I'd start off with the kind of system that we'd have, actually. That is the governance, actually, because instead of going straight into resources, the managing of it, well, I know very little about currency, because that kind of thing wasn't really, traditionally wasn't there. It was about looking after and managing properly, fairly and ethically all the resources in a country, in any part of a country, and so on. So that and a whole range of other things, decision making, conflict solving, things like that, always started off from a relationalist point of view. So you'd look at the whole of life from a relationalist point of view. or a survivalist point of view. Aboriginal people decided long ago that what came out of this relationship between humans and land was that, first of all, deciding that there are two essential relationships that exist: the one between people and land, the one between people. The one between people is always contingent on the one between land and people, always has to be. That's for security's sake too, but for us, a stable, for stability's sake, and so on. So an ethic arose because the idea was that land invented us, so we're always going to be forever grateful, obliged to look after land. It keeps looking after us, so we have to keep looking after it, and so on. So we look after it, and we learn about embedding relationality, relationalism, and the relationalist ethos within our society, both individually and collectively. So we have to start from that point of view. While survivalism is there, what relationalism does is it looks after, or it contends with, looks after any kind of survivalist tendencies. And a survivalist ethos tendencies are to see the others as competitive enemies. So Aboriginal people avoided that. Heading for security, you have to actually share, not just share for virtue's sake, but as a way of life, and as a way of being grounded, besides being ethical, a common sense way of looking after the country. So looking after the country is the template for looking after each other. So you share in managing resources. For example, the big Murray River system, Murray-Darling system, dozens, I don't know how many exactly, but clans all across that looked after it jointly, collaboratively, and so on, relationally, over thousands of years. And that gave security to everybody. If they'd have started competing, that's the end of security, So relationalism takes care of socialist tendencies. Survivalist tendencies. You have to share. Also, the idea of not, we were never democratic. And still not today. Some people like it, but most people prefer the consensus style. And I'm very encouraged by looking at things like, for example, there has been some ideas in different European countries of having citizens' assemblies or people's assemblies. So bring the power sharing down to the local level. So you'd have random, from what I know about this assembly idea, you'd have randomly chosen people in say across a couple of suburbs. They would meet together to discuss current affairs and current problems, everything, large ones to small ones, their local problems. You'd have experts there, experts in all sorts of ways, economic, environmental, and so on and so on. You'd have all of that there. But they wouldn't run things. They would be advising this group of people, and they would be randomly chosen, and just all kinds of people, local people, teachers, pensioners, young people, old people, workers, not workers, professional people, and so on, so on, so on. So power, the big problem that all human populations and groups had to work out was how to sort out the idea of power and authority. So, and that's why Aboriginal people sort of ended up not having anything like democracy, because the people who you want to be not so much like rulers, but if you want to call them rulers, all right, the people in charge or the small administrative group, they have to be knowledgeable and ethical. They have to be knowledgeable. So you'd have a whole, in the Aboriginal sense, it was a whole lot of elders, but young people too, who are very, very smart, very smart, very talented, skilled, and so on. They would be the knowledgeable people. You have to have people who know what they're doing and are good self-managers, who are the administrative kind of people who look after the whole population, you know. And of course, they have to be ethical. It goes without saying, you know. But in democracy, it's a gamble. So you end up with anybody who may or may not have any of those skills, you know. So you're just trusting, and you get to be democratic. The whole country, you know, the population gets to be democratic once every 3 or 4 years. Do you know what I mean? And the rest of the time is left up to people who run things, you know, and that can be any system, hierarchical or whatever, you know. So hierarchies were a no-no for Aboriginal people too, you know. So I would say try not to have too many hierarchies, or have soft hierarchies, have balance in the idea of power and authority, have balance, you know, between men and women. So women run countries too, you know. It should be just taken for granted that women run countries, and but basically running countries together, essentially, you know, not a hierarchy with males occupying the top. What's the name? So consensus, all of those sorts of things, and of course the big one is the constant looking after the land, looking after the environment. Call it whatever you like, the biodiversity, you know, nature with a capital N or nature with a lowercase n, in preparation for the big things that are already here, as many people say, climate change and so on and so on. So you have to keep looking after the place, because that is the thing, that is how you embed ethics in people and in collectives. You have to embed it, and especially in schools. For example, I would have a system where not only were, in Australia, say, people, schools would be teaching about Aboriginal culture and ways of doing things and so on and so on, but I would also have philosophy as definitely as important as maths and English and history and geography and things like that. They would have to do philosophy, all of them, you know, from young age up to high school. And it has to be taken really seriously, because people in this global system, they have to learn how other people think too. They have to learn about not just what to think, but how to think, what thinking actually is, what logic is, but especially other cultures too. So they get the idea that, yes, all kinds of people run the world, you know, or they're part of the world and so on. That's really extreme. So those two things, combined with looking after the land, they'd be taught literally to look after the land as so environment or environmental studies would be a key part. So I'm just looking at the moment, I was invited to be on the board of the local Aboriginal school, Murray School in Acacia Ridge in Brisbane. And that's what we're doing. We're not altering the curriculum, but adding to. So philosophy and environmental studies, they're two extra things. Also the history. History might be tinkered with a bit. Well, at least to get the real history, you know, not the approved of history. try and be a bit fair about that and more informative about it. But of course, an Aboriginal society, Aboriginal culture, and so on. So whichever country we're talking about, I just think that this kind of re-looking or reconceptualizing what education actually is should be like a preparation kind of thing for the future, because instead of only looking at things now at the moment, you know, like climate change, don't only look at it in a survivalist mode. Don't just get eaten up by a survivalist mode. Consider together a relationalist ethos, the relationalist, you know, so the structure, governance, education, and so on and so on, along with survivalist, you know. So that's what I would do. Sorry.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
And I didn't do a great job of introducing Dr. Mary Graham, So I apologise for that. And
yeah, you're right.
you're in Queensland, so not far from Brisbane, which is
Yeah,
I
Gold
spent
Coast.
I spent a fair bit of time in Maluka, which is where my grandmother lived for a long time. Since we have a minute, can I ask you, and you've got some time
Yes.
here, from what you're saying, the relationalist kind of model is one way of knowing if a person is well, they will be in good relationship with
Good relations.
with the earth and with kin and with are there other ways that sort of additions to that you would say this is what I would see in someone who is well or someone who has a good quality of life?
I would well, two things. I would go further with it, not just between individuals, but between collectives like communities, towns, cities, you know. But I would also say states too. To me, two big, powerful states at the moment, starting to being competitive, you know. Especially one wants to be competitive. See, I think it's a wrong turn, mainly because, not being anti anything or anybody, is that the idea of empire or hegemons are outgrown. They're ready for the knacker's yard, those sort of concepts. They don't work anymore, if ever they did work. But now there's nothing left to discover, except outer space, I suppose. But nothing left to look at to in a way to exploit or whatever at the moment in the world, you know. So there has been political ideas about multipolarity. I don't know if people are familiar with this. Instead of having empires, instead of having unipolarity kind of ideas, have multipolarity ideas. A lot of countries want that. Certain countries don't want that. They want to stick with the unipolarity. You know, they want to stick with empires. They don't realise that it's on its way out and it's past its use-by date, basically. So something far more positive has to come from a global system. And I think all of that, as I said before, I don't know much about currency or straight, stark economics, but a fairer system has to be sought. You know, you look at I was just looking at the news before, so many riots and fights and wars breaking out. And a lot of it is because governments are doing a bad job of governing. Do you know what I mean? They just simply do not realise or see or want to see that a different system, that's what people in both, not only in poor countries, but all kinds of countries, Western and non-Western, are crying out for a different political system. You know, so different governance. Plus, they want to have some kind of how can you say it, a build-up, or not a build-up. They want to be able to have a sense of confidence in the people who run the country. That sense of confidence, if it was there, it was at a low level. But when you look after the people, when you have a law of obligation that says you must look after the people, not you look after the country, look after the land, and so on, but look after the people, the poor, and so on. Then people that reinvigorates and strengthens people's confidence in their system, in their government system. But governments, I don't know, they seem to just ignore this and go on ignoring it. And then they wonder why there's so many riots in the street, you know. I don't know, it just seems, common sense to me. You know, that's one thing that Aboriginal people can say, that the system, we didn't go the Western way or, you know, technological kind of idea, but they did have this idea of, you know, it's sustainable. It's common sense, it's logical, it's looks after people, you know, it has a law of obligation, and that makes people feel secure. You don't go invading other people's area. That also makes people, you can have conflict, but you can't go the whole hog and invade other people's place. And there are some countries that are looking at that right now, you know, and are doing it. So a complete overhaul of modern life and its institutions, I suppose, and not so hierarchical. more flat, women, men and women running society, running politics, governing basically quite equally. Call it equality, but I prefer to say balance myself. It works. And also, all the brains trust, that's a proper brains trust, male and female, real for real. Yeah, I guess there's other things too, but that's, yep, I'll leave it there.
Sorry, that's wonderful. I appreciate that enormously, and thank you so much. I will hand over to Associate Professor Daniela Heil, and for questions, I am collecting those, and I will come back, and it'll be interesting to see how the group of people respond to those broader questions. That's right. So thank you so very much.
Okay, thank you.
I share a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, just as a bit of a background, that's why I think sometimes pictures are nice. I just wanted to start by actually officially also acknowledging the Awabakal and Worimi peoples upon whose land I work and live. And I wish to include the Ngyiampaa, Pakenchi and Wiradjuri peoples in central Western New South Wales, who have actually adopted and accepted me into their families and who continue to share their life stories with me and have done so since the late 1990s. Thank you. I will be talking about Ngyiampaa people today because not only because they share their life stories with me, but also because we collaborate on particular projects together and have done so since 1997, 1998. So these are the stories I'm presenting, and I will show you the next slide so you have a bit of a sense where that area is, right? Just as a kind of give you an idea. We don't have the distances here, but it gives you a bit of a geographic location idea where the community of Murrin Bridge is located. Murrin Bridge is on the Lachlan River, and it's in not only New South Wales, it's also the Australian state in which different Aboriginal language groups first experienced European occupation. They've become participants in colonial encounters since 1788 in the east and from the 1850s in the western regions of the state. A very dramatic, traumatic, and terrible part of Ngyiampaa people's life story and past is that they have were made participants, if I may say so, in a resettlement strategy in the what is kind of to many of us not here in Australia known as the assimilation period, to basically turn different language groups into white fellas, to say it bluntly. Murrin Bridge was founded as an Aboriginal station in that resettlement process in 1949. And yes, the government resettled the majority of the residents from a reserve at Menindee, which is over 300 kilometers to the west in Pakenchi country. Previous to Menindee, from 1924 to 1933, the majority of those people had lived in a government settlement at Kurora Tank, which is sort of, you see this near Bulkania, further north, but slightly northwest from Murrin Bridge, if I may say so, as far as this map is concerned. The kind of primary language as part of this resettlement process is because many people initially came from Kurora Tank, that region and area, is Ngyiampaa. However, if we look at the language groups actually, and I'll do this in a moment, we can Actually, what's happening with my... No, I'm frozen for some reason. Oh, here, hang on, I'll try this. That works. Okay, sorry about that. You can actually see where Murrin Bridge is positioned, which is sort of the northwestern corner of Wiradjuri country. But also Karora Tank is positioned in Ngyiampaa country and Menindee in Paarkantji country in the western part of New South Wales. So in that process, and kind of, this is sort of an extension of, and I'm actually very glad that Mary said what she said, because of course, when I, obviously as a non-Indigenous anthropologist, work and regularly meet with the people who've accepted me into their community and adopted me into their families, is very clearly the idea of who are we and what do we mean when we talk about feeling well, being well, and referring to what that actually is. What do we mean from our perspective? What does it mean to us in comparison to others who continuously have shaped and kind of influenced and dominated this process, right? On behalf of the people, but of course, it's not a choice the people themselves have made. It's an important point to bring to the fore. So the kind of significant shaping of contemporary, and I mean, I started working there, as I said, in the late 1990s, Murrin Bridge residents' everyday life and practices and the kind of historical background they have experienced derives largely from the obligations and the demands of kin-relatedness and what local people themselves refer to as either enjoyment or work-related practices. Each and all of those practices put particular emphases on people's presence and visibility in interactive engagements with others, as well as their personal obligations to others, right? So it's a kind of reciprocal, I'll pass on, I'll give, I receive, but it's not necessarily a harmonious process that, you know, everybody contributes the same amount, etc. And it's not only a kind of sharing and caring approach, but it also often has to do with and includes economic resources, for instance, and taking care of others and ensuring that, for instance, the children have their food when they go to school and have a sandwich in their hand and don't stand out as the ones who don't have, etc. Right? So this is a kind of very dynamic and complex and kind of ongoing scenario and everyday life and practices and what is going on and who's shaping what for whom and making contributions to it, but also receiving from others. So these kind of demands from the kind of practices and the kind of demands of kin-relatedness, but also the integration of these relations into the so-called leisure time or enjoyment and work is very clearly something that, for instance, does, you know, it's not just obligation, but it's also has a lot to do with enjoyment and actually doing things together and engaging with each other. And for instance, that may mean playing cards or buying cigarettes or even, you know, to have drinks with others. And by mentioning those kind of activities, I'm not mentioning this to indicate there is never any problem, but it also is not something that kind of prioritizes or refers to the fact, you know, people may be consuming alcohol or they may not be consuming alcohol, but it also has to do with spending time with each other, working on relationships, reiterating relationships, maintaining them, reproducing them, changing them, shifting them, adding further details or knowledge into the conversations. That is the priority of these kind of get-togethers and doing something, right? Of course, the point is that doesn't mean that it's all romantic or people are people. Even, you know, people from your or my background have their issues, right? It doesn't mean that in a kind of ethnic, from a kind of focusing on this from an particular perspective, means that there's never any problems or never any fights or never any disagreements, right? That is normal, that is part of life. Each and all of us do experience that. But of course, there is a kind of something that is very different and distinctive in reference to how I have and continue to experience it in the kind of Ngyiampaa community I work with. And that very clearly has to do with the fact that it's very clearly about the ways in which relationships, and whether this has to do with enjoyment or, you know, taking people for a ride in one's car and visiting a relative in a nearer or more distant community, or making sure that one joins, for instance, others who may go to a TAFE in town, which is like 15 kilometers away from the community, and kind of has a cup of tea with them and a yarn before one kind of returns to the other obligations, whether they are work related or other ones, you know. So in that sense, these kind of distinction of, as local Ngyiampaa people themselves refer to them, enjoyment, and in comparison to this work, demonstrate, but also continuously reinforce the kind of importance for people to be socially present, regularly visible within the kind of social and realms, and kind of actively engage in them, which also requires, of course, that one is socially present, and one is also at the same time, by participating in this, involved in social obligations and being responsive to the demands of others, and they are primarily kin and extended kin. Second cousins, third cousins, and so on, right? So it's not a kind of clear-cut family, but I mean, I, for instance, have joined multiple times people to visit relatives in other parts of Australia, and we're often talking here about places that may be 700 kilometers away, right? But there's always some relational connection where one would be able to stay and participate and be taken care of. And of course, then in kind of reverse, one makes a contribution to this, right? So in that sense, participating in this social world means that one kind of is at the same time not only participating in this so-called social modus operandi, but also within which this kind of self is constituted and transformed and reconstituted and maintained, and one is responsive to, and one is responded to by others. So this is a kind of very processual, ongoing, everyday life and practices, but also experience for each participant within, right? And this is sort of for instance, people like policymakers who sit in Canberra and fly in for 1 hour, they don't actually have that experience, or that they can't unfortunately experience it, because basically their clock is ticking, they're going there with a purpose, but they're not even prepared to listen, right? And this is sort of something that I've encountered multiple times over many, many years. For instance, there was once a kind of health-related session. So you had some mainstream health educators, and they visited for one afternoon, and they'd driven 2 or 3 hours from Bathurst, and they turn up in the community. And their idea was, which was basically what some kind of mainstream health organization had initiated them to do and asked them to do, is to basically educate people on improving their health and how to kind of lower alcohol consumption, right? But of course, they have very preconceived ideas that are set up that have no understanding and do not reflect any understanding of what is actually going on and what is happening here, right? And this is sort of sometimes quite amazing, because some of the questions that are asked clearly reflect this. And this is sort of, I'm not trying to play the blame game with this comment. But it's actually, you need to spend a lot of time, and you need to actually experience and learn what is going on from people themselves, to actually work out for them, with them, from their perspective, what it is they need and what the reason is, right? And for what the kind of requirements for this are. And this is often a problem, because it's sort of more or less sort of comes across like a tick the boxes approach, but it's actually not having sufficient experience for these well-intended people. I'm not saying they're not well-intended, but to kind of actually learn and understand deep down in 120%, not just 60%, what is actually going on in those circumstances. So in that sense, many people who turn up who don't actually have these experiences don't necessarily understand the intensity of this kind of these relations. It's, when I initially encountered, I admit it fully, it's really exhausting. It's like sometimes you're sort of pulled in multiple directions, because it's like, I need to make sure I'm here. I need to make sure I'm there. I need to add to this. I need to actually learn and have a conversation with so-and-so, what happened at home and what it means and what it is they require and what they would like to do, and how we can sort of mediate this in this kind of supportive, caring, but also always kind of others being there to support mode, if you like. And so in that sense, what I would like to say in a concluding way with this is that Ngyiampaa social selves, or the kind of people taking care of others, this is sort of Ngyiampaa people are in a sense social selves oriented towards other always. There is no exception to this, but it's also something that is fundamentally interdependent. And their social participation remains the essence of personhood. And accordingly, this is also the essence of what it means for each and all of them to be socially valued and hence well and feel well. What they embody, what they experience is not something that is contained within individuals, but it is very clearly a social orientation. And it is that social orientation is defined and informed by kin-relatedness and social obligations. And I can sort of the area, which is probably greener than you imagine it to be. This is not in January, but when it's very hot, but gives you a bit of a feeling, an idea who people are. And this is sort of lastly the kind of where we go with this. And I already talked about the first points, but I also would like to conclude it with a fact or the kind of point that very clearly the kind of inner or community internal engagements with, for instance, non-Indigenous practices and instructions, such as, for instance, health services. There is a clinic, there is a health service, there is a primary school, right? Of course, they have Ngyiampaa and Wiradjuri teachers, but also there is many non-Indigenous teachers who contribute to this, right? So you kind of, in a communal sense, these kind of engagements are not purely Ngyiampaa community oriented, but they go beyond and they're influenced by these kind of daily encounters. And in that sense, we need to kind of make sure that we also, from the perspective of local people, very clearly do not simply try and kind of engage people and kind of in a sort of neo-colonial sense, if you like, which is sort of a following primarily non-Indigenous policies in this country, education, health, or whatever else it would be, but very clearly is a prioritizing of what is the experience people have, but also what is their knowledge and how can this actually be used, shifted and incorporated into amending and changing so that it fully accommodates Ngyiampaa perspectives and understandings. And I think this is a very essential point, which I've sort of now put in my own words. Obviously, I've got a sort of other, more information on this, but I mean, there's endless numbers of stories that reiterate this. And if I may say so, having worked there since the late 1990s, this is not something that has happened yet. There have been multiple attempts, but we need to keep pushing to ensure this is eventually adopted, incorporated, and shifting and changing. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. I think that slide is a fantastic sort of summary, closing kind of material, and look, that will be available in the recording, so we can sort of sit with it and look through it more fully at the time. Thank you. So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Eija Ranta, who is in Finland, and it'll be interesting to see some international perspectives and where there are similarities and differences. And then we will come back as a whole group at the end. So please think about questions that you might have for the panel at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Eija Ranta. I am University Researcher of Global Development Studies at the University of Helsinki in Finland, where we are just starting today. It's about 9 or 10 o'clock here. I first want to warmly thank the organizers for this opportunity to participate in this really important event and really important webinar series. And I am particularly grateful for the opportunity to learn from First Peoples Australia and from Indigenous people's experiences in your countries. My talk for today is entitled Learning from Indigenous Views of Quality of Life in Latin America. And with that, I hope to shed light on some interesting comparisons between diverse Indigenous experiences and probably to spark a dialogue about their possible similarities and differences. I also wish to bring in some examples about Indigenous quality of life and well-being from Sami Indigenous scholars from Finland. And with that, I want to pay respect to Sami peoples and to acknowledge their Sapmi lands and territories that we Finns and other Nordics have colonized through state interventions, educational system, and welfare policies. I will start my presentation by introducing how I ended up collaborating with Indigenous activists in Latin America. Then I move into conceptualizing Indigenous well-being and quality of life, particularly in Bolivia and Ecuador. Then I bring in some Sami examples and finally conclude with remarks on the difficulties of implementing any kind of alternative views of quality of life at the level of concrete policy making and in interactions with the colonial state. Well, first to start, my engagement and collaborations with Indigenous movements and Indigenous politics started in Bolivia in 2001, where I first worked at an Indigenous organization which was promoting Indigenous cosmologies as an alternative to Western conceptualizations of development. I will now start sharing with you a slide from which you can gain basic information about the context. Indigenous activists' stark critique of the Western concept of development, including the idea of the necessity of economic growth, made a huge impression on me. Development, progress, modernization that for many Europeans probably may have meant increased prosperity and economic opportunities was built on colonial conquest, colonial violence, and exploitation of Indigenous lands, territories, resources, and labor in Latin America. This is what Argentinian scholar Walter Mignolo has called the darker side of Western modernity. Indigenous activists with whom I interacted were fed up with the discourses and practices of international development aid, of which I was part, Finland being an international development aid donor country, even if a small one. Indigenous activists in Bolivia felt that Indigenous peoples were always perceived merely as objects of interventions rather than being active agents of their own lives and societies. Furthermore, they felt that they were only seen through problems, through poverty, social problems, or any other negative issues that were usually defined by outsiders. As an alternative to this, the Indigenous organization where I volunteered aimed at revitalizing Indigenous knowledges and cosmological wisdoms through which they could redefine development on their own terms and through positive remarks such as reciprocity, communality, and environmental sustainability. When in 2006, Evo Morales became the first indigenous president of Bolivia, I started a doctoral thesis project about the possibilities and challenges of transforming the whole nation state policies and legislation through indigenous people's notions of a good life or living well. That is vivir bien in Spanish, sumac causai in Quechua, sumac camania in Aymara, and buen vivir as the similar process is called in Ecuador. Some of these concepts had been the exact concepts that the indigenous organization and indigenous activists with whom I interacted were utilizing as an alternative to Western development. And with the rise, with the political peasant unions and other previously marginalized groups, suddenly these concepts actually started to circulate very widely within the sphere of the state, instead of circulating merely at grassroots communities as it had a few years earlier. And for me, of course, as a scholar of development, I saw a huge opportunity for learning about how we could rethink the international development aid system and concepts related to development and well-being through this particular context. What then did these alternative concepts of indigenous well-being or well-living and quality of life mentioned here in the slide mean? In Bolivia, it was the Aymara indigenous scholars, especially Simon Ngyiampaa, Mario Torres, and others who theorized the concept of sumac camania during the 1990s and early 2000s. In my ethnographic encounters with Simon Ngyiampaa, he defined sumac camania as the Aymara's harmonious paradigm of life, bringing lands, territories, reciprocal social relations, and spiritual aspects into a balanced unity, as opposed to what he was calling the Western matrix of development. In linguistic terms, the meaning of the Aymara word suma is pleasant and good, as well as excellent and perfect, while camania refers to the verb to live, to reside, and to take care of each other. Together, they entail both social and ecological dimensions, that of living in harmony with family, kin, and community, but also with the physical surroundings of lands and territories. If in contemporary societies, conviviality tends to refer solely to the sphere of the social, which is detached from the living earth, sumac camania rather suggested the opposite, intimate interdependency between humans and non-humans. In Spanish, Ngyiampaa utilized the concept convivir bien, which translates as living well together. The word together referring here to both humans and non-humans, and specifically the Ayllu. The Ayllu was the traditional spatial organization of the Aymara nations prior to the colonial conquest, first by the Inca state Tawantinsuyu and later the Spanish. Each Ayllu territory had territory in different ecological zones along the Andean mountain range, that produce different crops and food staples, and an elaborate system of economic exchange and reciprocity existed between them, maintained through kinship gifts and labor obligations. Of course, these relationships have been very profoundly impacted by a long history of colonialism and capitalism. At the same time as Ngyiampaa and other Aymara activists were starting to give salience to Sumakkamania during the 1990s, struggles for the return to collective ownership of traditional indigenous territories in the Bolivian Andes were gaining strength. Subsequently, discourses of Sumakkamania played an instrumental role in the revitalization of the IUs by Andean indigenous movements. So well-being and quality of life were clearly related and dependent on lands, territories, self-government, and ultimately indigenous self-determination against the colonial conquests and atrocities of the state and global capitalism as the economic system sustaining the Westphalian nation-state system. Instead of material aspects, person who fulfills their responsibilities towards the IU was understood to be rich and living a good life because they were surrounded by a web of social, economic, and spiritual relations and have the capacity to live with each other's in mutual support. And in Bolivia, there are 36 recognized indigenous peoples. So of course, different kinds of conceptualizations of this kind of good life can be found among them. But they were all brought up together into a state discourse through this Spanish notion of vivir bien. All in all, the essence of vivir bien or Sumakkamania as indigenous well-being or well-living is indisputably indigenous self-determination. Self-determination is also a key concept that Sami research professor Rauno Kuokkanen has discussed in her recent book, Restructuring Relations, Indigenous Self-Determination, Governance and Gender, which focuses particularly on Arctic indigenous peoples. And here you can see a slide that provides you some basic information about the Sápmi territory and Sami people here in Finland and other Nordic countries. Among the Sami, Rauno Kuokkanen argues the welfare state system with its ideals of egalitarianism and individualism has diminished discussions about indigenous collective rights. What she calls difference-blind liberalism tends to treat all citizens as equals, and national governments tend to have the most say in Sami affairs, despite the Sami having cultural and linguistic autonomy. Particularly young Sami activists increasingly criticize this as state co-optation. While self-determination tackles indigenous people's relation to states in international law and politics, for the Sami and other Arctic indigenous peoples, as Rauno Kuokkanen aptly argues, the notion of self-determination extends beyond that. And I quote here her book, to encompass myriad other relationships, including the land, kinship, spirituality, and others. According to her, indigenous peoples, and I quote her again, self-determination is about a vision and struggle for restructuring relations of domination for a more just present and future for their societies and people. It is a foundational value informed by the norm of integrity, which fosters individual well-being and collective well-being. Good quality of life and well-being includes territorial integrity, cultural integrity, collective and individual integrity, and integrity of the land, Kuokkanen argues. Experiencing land, water, plants, and living earth as relations that are fundamental for survival and well-being creates a personal and communal responsibility for take care, which is essential in Sami conceptualizations of well-being. Just to conclude, I want to bring in few ideas about the difficulties in implementing such alternative views of quality of life or living well as vivir bien o sumar camania in Bolivia is. Of course, I already mentioned the long history of colonialism, long history of capitalism, and all kinds of global processes that have changed possibilities to live indigenous lives through their own principles and through self-determination. In Bolivia, there was really an attempt to bring in these concepts as key guiding principles of state, the whole nation state. But first of all, most public servants working in state ministries and institutions did not really have much knowledge, expertise, or even interest to restructure policy ideas through these concepts. Second, many public servants felt that the states of the world are situated within an international system, certain kinds of international politics and system of statistics that works, for example, through cross-domestic product and other similar statistics that you can't, as an individual country, suddenly bring up something completely different. The biggest problem, probably from the perspective of people at community level, was on how this new state that self-identified as being an indigenous state, how it sustains itself economically. And the biggest problem has definitely been an increased extractivism of natural resources from indigenous lands by a government that self-identifies as indigenous government. The disillusionment of many indigenous activists towards the possibility of the state working through indigenous concepts started particularly since 2011, when conflicts between governments, extractivist policies, and large-scale development projects in indigenous territories sparked an international debate known as the Tiffany's case. In a conversation early last year with two indigenous elders from a movement that during the first years of government supported very strongly Evo Morales' presidency and his political party, they explained to me about the controversies by stating that, and I quote here, "We all supported Morales' presidency because we thought that when an indigenous person would be governing, all indigenous peoples would gain benefits. We also thought that we would be controlling our own natural resources. However, it did not go that way. On the contrary, towards abroad, Evo Morales was defending the Mother Earth However, here in Bolivia, it was the opposite. The end of quote. In fact, indigenous elders felt that the government had appropriated indigenous cosmologies through which they legitimized extractivist policies that were very harmful for indigenous territories and actually quite similar to earlier neoliberal governments. At times, extractivist conflicts even led to police or military repression of indigenous environmental and human rights activists, which has probably a little bit depoliticized some parts of the indigenous movement. So in conclusion, new ideals and initiatives for conceptualizing indigenous good life or living well were not really well sustained by the reality of the still very colonial state, which is structured on traditions of conquests, dispossessions, and extractivisms. These alternative views exist and have always been there amidst plural indigenous nations, but the problem emerges once again in the very asymmetrical indigenous state encounters. I think I will leave it here and welcome very much the forthcoming discussion. Thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to this.
Thank you, Eija. And thank you to all our speakers this afternoon. And I'm certain there are multiple questions that people have. I've got some that have come through. And if it's okay, I might start with a question that came through recently that probably connects with where you were talking and then go back through with Marion and Daniela about that question of language. Language seems to kind of embody different concepts more effectively than some other languages. And so the question was, I wonder if speakers could talk about the role of language in relationship, in that if we are able to have access to learn Indigenous language, could that help us understand and live relationship differently through those methods? Now, yes, I thought the concepts you described, and then start there and then head back to the other speaker.
Are you asking us all?
Yeah, I thought I might start with
Oh,
if that's okay, just because some of the concepts you mentioned in particular language, and then come back to
Sure. Right. Okay.
Sorry, Chris. I didn't. I didn't listen so well. It was about the language.
Yes, and whether using new language or old languages, perhaps Indigenous languages, may actually help us live relationships differently in that language embodies concepts in a particular way and worldview.
Oh yes, definitely. In those countries where governments have tried to co-opt this indigenous conceptualization to state policy, they have been translated to the colonial language, which is Spanish, and quite many indigenous activists have complained that is where the misunderstandings start, and that meanings are lost in translation.
Well, I find the meanings have been lost in some translations, but then I think because I don't really speak my own language fully, completely with the grammar. There is because in the old days, which was not too long ago actually, it was against the law for Aboriginal people to even speak their own language. They could be punished. Do you know, you had to speak English, whether you liked it or not. But of course, a lot of it went underground, so people continued to speak. But over the years, they lost, especially the grammar part of it, you know, speaking just straight out. So what we end up with is, many of us, many different parts of the country, is with word lists. So in my own language, Yugambeh, there is a quite comprehensive word list, but not so much the grammar, you know. The last full speaker, an uncle, he died many years ago now, sometime in the 90s, you know, that was the last full-on speaker kind of thing. So a lot of people who do writing, who are actual writers, like novelists, poets, academics, all kinds of people, professional people or whatever, artists and so on, quite often they'll use a word or terms to explain something. And of course, there's been all sorts of things, experiments, role plays, all sorts of stuff. For example, one they did, one which was done with school children, young Aboriginal girl and a young white girl, they had to describe a painting, the contents of a painting. And the contents were just as, it was a simple painting of a boat on the beach by the water. So the young white girl had to, you know, translate that, sort of describe what she sees. See? And that's what she said, a boat by the beach, on the beach by the water. The young Aboriginal girl was asked, and she explained it, she described it exactly the same, but in her own language. And how she explained it in her own language was boat, beach, water, ness, N-E-S-S. So the character, the whole thing was all put together. This is how far this relationalist thing goes. It's in throughout language too. So all of it has to be together. The three things, they're nouns, but the observer is in it too. So the observer is experiencing the nature of, or the characteristics of this scene. So the observer is never outside what they're looking at. The observer is not outside the observed world. They're in the observed world too. So this is the problem with probably languages all over the world. But then, and then the other part of that is that some terms are untranslatable, I find. And many people, English and non-English speaking people, find that too. You can't explain, there's no equivalent in the English, or vice versa too, in an English term, no equivalent. So in my own writing, I'll use words, a German word meaning Weltanschauung meaning worldview, you know. It fits it, because our system is not really a philosophy, not in the Western sense, you know, exploring the nature of things, the good, the beautiful, blah, blah, blah. And it's not it isn't what do you say, an ideology either. You know, it's not anything like that. But a worldview, a just general all-purpose worldview that fits it. And Weltanschauung, which I've seen before, fitted it perfectly. Other terms, I use a Greek term sometimes. Axiopopeia. It means something like to arrive at a condition of being worthy of what is proper. And I was looking for an explanation that would describe how we view elders, older people, knowledgeable people. That's exactly what it is. So a person who is knowledgeable is not only knowledgeable, but has to be ethical. So ethics is part of being knowledgeable. You know, they're not two separate things. They've got to go together. And there's a couple of other words like this too, you know. Regarder pour voir, how you look at something with the idea of behold. You're looking at it. You're not just looking at a thing. It's a relationship between two things, you know. So different words, but also coming up with different terms that might mean something, like when you were, who's it, Daniela, when you were describing that system over there, down there, that other mob. I know what you mean. I know exactly what you mean, and I've been trying to describe it myself, and from observations of my own mob, family, relations, friends, other communities, traveling into, you know, traditional communities where their language is intact, you know, basically. And I'm trying to describe the relationships with each other. And I'm working on at the moment a notion which I called autonomous regard. We are all autonomous beings, all of us. Everybody, and women are definitely autonomous, you know, they're their own boss. But regard is like respect multiplied 10 times. So regard is a way of looking. That's why that French word is there. Looking at something, you look and then you see, you know. But also it's at a distance. It's not close up. You can't see properly when you're really close up to something or someone, you know. You can see a bit, you know, but you can't properly see it in its background, in its context and things like that. So autonomous regard can be used personally, individually, collectively, but also between states. At the moment, the EU has a term, I don't know what the actual, in language, German probably, but it's about strategic autonomy. It's a strategic autonomy, very different from autonomous regard. Autonomous regard is how you actually talk and treat each other, but strategic autonomy is understandably, you know, quite understandably in modern politics, geopolitics, is kind of almost like a board game kind of idea of strategy, you know, autonomous strategy. How to stay safe between two warring elephants. How do you do that? By being extremely careful. And I can understand it. It's perfectly understandable, you know. It's pretty hard, you know, just to exercise autonomous regard with someone who's a giant, you know, and who's threatening you, you know, with sanctions and things like that. So, yeah, language is incredibly important. And to get it right, you know.
I could just add something to that, which kind of just opens up this conversation and kind of it extends it. At Murray Bridge, they have actually, they're teaching Ngyiampaa to the youngest ones, right? And
that's wonderful.
And that's
sorry to interrupt, love. I should have said actually that's what they're doing here on the coast. They teach in the school, not all the schools, but some of the schools are Yugambeh to all the kids. You know. Sorry, go on.
No, fine, Mary. But the interesting thing is that was really a communal initiative, right? And many elders kind of wrote the dictionary, and wonderful. The funny, peculiar thing, if I may say so, is, and it's, I know them all, obviously, and I've known them for many decades. And it's interesting because some of the teachers, one is a Wiradjuri lady, and she says, I feel really odd because this is not my language, right? But I'm teaching the little ones Ngyiampaa words. And I often practice at home for days and days to make sure I pronounce them correctly. And they're not identical languages, obviously. No,
right? Of course not. No.
And but it's kind of this determination. We need to maintain this. We
Absolutely.
need to pass it on, and we need to ensure people basically learn it and are aware of it and continue to be aware of it. So the dictionary was written by local
wonderful.
People. Wonderful. They have records, and AFRHub has a copy of it too, because people have the community has ensured to store it at AFRHub as well. And there's handwritten notes, and the linguist Tamzin Donaldson, who passed unfortunately 13 years ago, she used to be based in Canberra, and she worked at Murray Bridge and in the whole region, Karora Tank and other Menindee and so on. So she was quite instrumental in making sure these words are not forgotten, right? And I actually met her once, unfortunately, at a funeral of one of the elders. And it was interesting. The language is not used, as you said, Mary, as well, because basically the mission manager at the time from 1949 to 1958 made sure people don't speak the language, right? And it's like they would basically punish them and kind of really painful stuff, right? So, and I mean, there's still this continuation of being aware. We actually learned a lot too, but of course it was very detrimental as far as not maintaining the language as perfectly as would have otherwise been possible. If that's the case. So, but the interesting thing is, and this is something I will never forget because it's a demonstration. Tamzin at that in that particular location, when I met her in the community, spoke with two of the elder ladies, and she said, remember that word, Iowan. And then sort of the two women would nod, and she would say, that means you're taking care of someone. You're taking care of us here, you're feeding us. But of course, this is food that you have hunted and gathered, and it's now here on the table, and it goes into your stomach. And it's basically a reiteration of that connection to land, food, and being taken care of, right? Now, I'll never forget that. This story, because
you know that they mightn't have explained it like this, but that is actually, they're talking to you about multi-dimensional time.
Yeah.
Do you know that?
Yeah, exactly.
That's what it's about.
Yes.
You know, there may not be any actual word for it, or but there may be. Who knows? But it's throughout. You know, it's across.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you all.
Go,
I know that I would love to ask Hamed in 1 minute, just before we close off in a couple of minutes, just to say something about the next seminar, which is coming up next. But there was one question that I wouldn't mind asking if I can, that I don't know how you'll answer in a very, very short space of time. It's going to combine two questions. One is, how do we get policymakers in education, in health, and move those systems across? And another question was, are there good examples of, say, policy that has done this to move systems across to a relational model? So does anyone have, say, one example, just to close, of a policy that's done that well?
Well, could I say briefly, very briefly, in Brisbane, there is the Institute for Urban Indigenous Health. They work, their policies, Aboriginal policies, Aboriginal made, analysed, created and applied in their organisation, has been incredibly successful because it's their Aboriginal policies. You know, they've worked out different ways of the actual, like the administration, the funding structures, how to make funding work for you and to make more. I mean, and they're not following Western ways of doing things, they're following Aboriginal ways of doing things. And with that in mind, that's what I always come back to the general idea of that Aboriginal affairs should be run by Aboriginal people, you know, basically in policy making, especially in the public administration, but in organisations and too. So that's all.
Thank you. That's beautiful. That's a really fabulous way, perhaps, to close. I'm sorry that there's probably lots of other things that people have wondered and wanted to ask or have asked. I apologise if I haven't captured things. There may be other examples of policy, and I appreciate it. I'm just conscious of time. Could I ask Hamed just to quickly give us a message about the next seminar that's coming up?
I'm sorry.
Let me also grant apologies to those we couldn't cover their questions. We have taken note of their questions, and hopefully we can cover them perhaps through some messages by emails. In terms of the next meeting, we will have the next webinar is allocated to the visions and views and experiences that come from third world countries. We will have Associate Professor Victoria Grieve-Williams and also Associate Professor Sarah Mota a Latin American British Australian colleague, as well as Professor Ashish Kothari from India. And they will share their views from the what we call global South or third world countries, or some may call them developing societies, developing countries. And we look forward to see you again there. Also, you might have noticed of a couple of messages I have put in the chat room about a survey that NENA Research Hub has designed. And we would like to also hear from you. So this conversation wouldn't be just a one-way conversation. We understand that it's we cannot actually hear from everyone through the webinar. So we thought that perhaps a short social survey may take you about 30 minutes or something to answer the questions. And there are some questions that are related to you, just to give us an idea how people's views of quality of life is shaped by their experiences, their background. But if you're not comfortable with those questions, of course, you can skip them and only answer those questions that are more relevant to your views about quality of life. And thank you so much again for attending this meeting. And thank you so much to our great presenters. So a lot of applauses, please.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Hamed.
Thanks.
And again, yeah, thank you to our speakers. Really appreciate
Thanks,
hearing
Chris.
from you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
Bye.